This podcast is being brought to you by Trinity College Dublin. For further information, please visit our website itunes.tcd.ie.
Thank you very much. So I would like to talk today a little bit about speech and speech characteristics and how that has implications for all of us. I suppose I started a little beginning to look at some definitions, and particularly looking at the WHO's statistics and definitions of disease, and particularly the ICD-10, which we're probably all very familiar with, where it mentions dementia, chronic changes in different areas, particularly impairment, looking at memory, thinking, orientation, comprehension, judgment, but also language. And if we look at the APA's definitions, also the DSM-4, the new revised versions, also looking at diagnostics in terms of dementia, we also see different changes. We see aphasia, apraxia, agnosia, so being able to, difficulty articulating speech or understanding speech, difficulty in terms of movement, difficulty in terms of interpretation of sensations. All of these things together, and then dysfunction as well in terms of executive order, in terms of being able to planning or arousal or attention. So these definitions are useful in some ways, but they've been criticised, and I think all of us will recognise that they're not ideal in many ways. And they're not ideal because they fail often to discriminate between the different types of dementia that actually exist. So there's a constant need, obviously, in terms of scientific investigation, in terms of the literature that we read all the time, in trying to make better ways to be able to predict dementia and different types of dementia. So there's a constant need looking for different types of biomarkers, for example, which are looking at in vivo testing and diagnosis, looking at protein and genetic biomarkers, looking at metabolic functioning, looking at neuroimaging, looking at EEG and fMRI, and also looking at changes in behavior. So it's the behavior side of things that I'd like to talk a little bit about today, and that's looking at speech and language. There's been great interest in the literature in the last number of years looking at reliable changes in behavior which can be picked up by changes in speech and changes in language. And a very interesting review came out earlier this year by Jamie Reilly in the University in Southern Florida, no relation to me at all, looking at cognition, language, and clinical pathologies associated with Alzheimer's dementia in the Journal of Communication Disorders. So it's an excellent review, and I'd recommend all of you to read with that. And I suppose the theory here is that speech and language pathology could be very important to play a role in discriminating different forms of dementia, but also in the diagnosis, but also in the management. And that's led us on to, here in Dublin, to look at a range of different types of projects, looking at older people. And probably the biggest project that we've been involved in lately has been the TRIL project, which some of you may know about. The TRIL project is a multidisciplinary project looking at aging across a number of different areas. Very much multidisciplinary, very much interinstitutional as well, with researchers coming from UCD, University College Galway, as well as Trinity College, working with industry in terms of Intel and GE Healthcare, coming together to be able to design technologies and understand the aging process in many ways. Critically important, though, is to have older people part of that design process. So what's the difference and what is the point of TRIL? Well, it's really trying to bring people together to be able to understand the changes in people as they go older, looking at understanding different types of changes, be they physical changes, be they psychological changes, be they social changes. Probably the biggest outcome so far is being able to develop a cohort, a data set of very rich information that can be looked across these biopsychosocial aspects of aging. As I mentioned, it's the older person which is critical in the design process, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. I suppose what also has made a difference is our focus is on early assessment and intervention. How can we detect early changes in aging which could be important to be able to hopefully to make some intervention which could have an impact. Also to look at in terms of technologies, can we use technologies which can be reusable, can be scalable to larger populations, as opposed to being one-off devices or gadgets which might be applicable to one or more people. The interesting aspect also is moving the technology out from the laboratory but moving it into the home, and that's been a huge focus of the project as well. These are just a rough overview of some of the projects looking at gait and balance when we're looking at the physical and anatomical changes of aging, looking at alertness and attention, critically important as well. My colleague Joe will probably talk a little bit about aspects in terms of social care and looking at social interaction, and I'm going to speak a little bit about the project on the top right, which is looking at speech. So the TRIL project comes together, I suppose, a number of different areas, looking at falls prevention, social connection and interaction, and cognitive function. very much underpinned by allowing technology to be developed to support and understand these different aspects of aging, but very much grounded in terms of ethnography, understanding how the aging process affects all of us. The achievement so far, I suppose, has been being able to look at quite a large cohort of people. About 600 people have gone through the TRIL clinic here in St. James's, being able to be assessed across a number of different spectrum of areas. And that's been critically important to allow us to understand, as I say, this technology, how technology could actually interact with people who are aging in that way. So I want to talk about the specific projects that I've been involved in, which is looking at speech and speech characteristics. And we've called it the Dear Diary project. We know that cognitive function is critically important to all aspects of our life. We know that the integrity and vitality of the brain is critically important for independence. We also know that cognitive function in terms of memory, orientation, sharpness, problem solving, critically important. We also know that the consequences of changes in cognitive function are critically important also. Apathy, accidents, depression, self-neglect, isolation, physical illness. All of these aspects have huge impacts, of course, on quality of life and independence. So can we look at cognitive function in some way? Can we look at cognitive function and try to examine how it's actually changing embedded in normal routine? So how can we capture brain function through normal ways, not being able to bring people into MRI scanners or not being able to connect them to EEG systems? How can we capture changes in cognitive function through normal daily activity? And the point here is to be able to use speech to do that, and to be able to measure it against the gold standard measures of cognitive function, and to see how changes in speech and language could provide some window into cognitive function. The point, of course, is that can we detect early changes? And if we can detect early changes, can we have some intervention which could make some difference? So speaking behavior, sound characteristics, and voice, how do all those things coming together? Well, a couple of things to think about. How do we actually produce speech? Kind of 3 or 4 different areas here. We have to obviously conceptualize what we want to say, to put the words in our own mind, what we want to speak out. We have to formulate linguistically how we're actually going to speak those words itself. And then finally, the articulation, moving all the muscles and the articulators to be able to breathe out the particular sounds that we want to have. That's a lot of processes that have to happen in sequence to be able to articulate and speak the way we want to be able to communicate with others. So, what do we know about speech and how does it change as we get older? Well, from looking in the literature, there's been many studies which have shown that the rate of speech changes as we get older. We tend to speak a little bit slower as we advance in years. We also know that that's probably due to a number of different factors, probably due to physiological changes, so our changes in articulators and our breathing and our capacity, and the changes in our facial muscles. All of those things are going to change the rate of change of speech. Vision, psychosocial variables, cognition, all of these things are also going to change the rate of speech. And it's interesting that there's been a number of studies looking at different changes, particularly with different types of cohorts of patients. One of those has been looking at Parkinson's disease. A very interesting study came out in 2006 looking at the changes associated with speaking rate, associated with a cohort of Parkinson's patients, a cohort of healthy matched controls, a cohort of mild cognitively impaired older people. And this is a reading task that the subjects had to do. So it was a piece of paper that to read aloud a particular sentence and paragraph of text. And it was interesting the number of conclusions that they drew from those studies. We found that the control subjects and those suffering from Parkinson's disease were found to articulate pretty much at the same rate, where those with mild cognitive decline spoke certainly slower. What was also seen was that the controls and those with mild cognitive decline performed similarly, were able to increase or change the number of pauses between the words. So more pauses as we're speaking changes, and as a result could be a window into cognitive function. But what was also important is how we can change the articulation rate. Can we speak faster? Can we speak slower? And it was found that those, certainly the controls, to be able to change high speaking rate, slow speaking rate, obviously that was quite easy to do, whereas those with mild cognitive decline had great difficulty in changing the rate of speech. So we're looking at now slowing of speech down. We're looking at adding in more pauses into our sentences, for example, and being able to have difficulty changing the rate of articulation. So all of these could provide a window into cognitive function. Another very interesting study carried out in Spain in the early 2000s looked at recording data from approximately 80 people describing an image that they saw in a picture. And what was interesting there is that the speech that those individuals used could be mined and looked at for different types of patterns. And what was found that as we got older, we certainly had more speech describing what we were looking at in the picture. So as the picture was presented to the person describing what they're seeing in the picture, more speech was used, so the quantity increased. However, the cohesiveness or the connectedness of that speech was disjointed. So lots of speech being spoken out, but was it all linked together? Not in the same way as when we were younger. So lots of irrelevant messages that are portrayed as well, lots of different types of content. So that's also important in terms of how we're using speech and language as we get older changes also. Another very important study that was carried out back in the mid-90s by Hans Stassen in Zurich looked at schizophrenia, being able to record data from schizophrenic patients as they first presented to the hospital, recording different types of speech characteristics. Again, it was a reading task, so there was a paragraph of text that the patients had to read out. He also recorded them 2 weeks later after medication. And looking at the two different data sets, first presented and 14 days later, he was able to diagnose, just looking at speech variables and speech characteristics, approximately about 80% of the time, being able to differentiate between those with negative syndromes, positive syndromes, and those also susceptible to depression. So again, just looking at the characteristics of speech in terms of was it slow, was it fast, were there more pauses injected into the speech itself, and was there a loss of prosody or loss of rhythm? So these speech tasks, very simple tasks, actually just reading a paragraph aloud, could be very informative. So I thought it'd be useful just to describe some of the processes that are involved in our brains to be able to do something like that. We saw earlier that the formulation of speech is important, the articulation of speech is important, but it also involves different areas of the brain. Obviously, if we're reading something in front of us, we have to have the visual areas of the brain very much intact. And that's sending information then to the interpretation of the actual symbols that we see, the letters. How do we interpret the letters themselves? Then we need to talk to the different areas of the brain which are involved in controlling the muscles of the articulators, and other areas which are involved with attention and being able to formulate the sounds. And then finally, we need to be able to control the articulators themselves to be able to speak out the certain sounds. So a very complex network and dense grid of network of activities that have to happen in our brain to be able to speak out sounds in different ways. There are very different models. I apologize for the poor quality of the image here. Many different mathematical models of actually how this is taking place between, if I can get this to work here, between printed text coming in at the very beginning as you're reading the slide, for example, and being able to speak speech out at the other end. Number of different networks that have to come together. And it's important that as we're going through being able to decipher what we're actually seeing and being able to speak out different sounds, we're targeting different areas of the brain, as I showed you in the previous slide. For example, have we got good fluency to be able to describe things? Well, that then is looking at the semantic processing area of the brain. If we don't have good fluency and good verbal fluency to describe things, then that area could be in deficit in some ways. Have we got good ways of articulating different sounds and making different types of sounds? If we don't, maybe then we have the information processing area could be in deficit. So by looking at different aspects of speech, we could be able to pinpoint different areas of the brain which may be not working very successfully. So the rationale for our research has been, are there ways that we can extract information out of speech, which hasn't been done yet in scientific literature, which can inform us of changes in cognitive function in older people? And the research questions we looked at were, can we provide a window into cognitive function through speech? So could it be acquired in normal daily activity from somebody conversing with somebody else? Can we inform the status of someone's cognitive function to high reliability? Can we record activity in normal environments? So for example, if we're recording speech over the telephone, or can we record it in somebody's home, or do we have to go to a recording studio to do it? Can we do it in real life environments? And we wanted to be able to use different standard tasks to be able to do this. So the TRIL project that I mentioned earlier was able to acquire data from about 600 patients in Hospital 4 just across the way over here. And of those, about 187 were asked to carry out a reading test and were asked to read out a paragraph of text from a textbook. We had 235 people carry out a task which we call picture taboo, which was be able to describe what we're seeing in a picture without using taboo words. So for example, I don't know if you can see the image here clearly, there's people climbing a cliff here, but you're not able to describe that picture. You can't use the words climb and you can't use the words rope. So it's quite a difficult task to do. So it's going to challenge you to be able to describe that to somebody else. And then we also had 35 people carry out what's called a picture description task, which is just describe a picture without the two taboo words, and then comparing that with people where we had this taboo task mentioned also. And our aim here was to be able to record speech with a microphone like this one here, and then afterwards to compare the parameters that we could extract out of the characteristics of speech and compare them with gold standard measures of cognitive function. And those gold standard measures were these ones on the left here, so a number of different standard measures that many of you may be familiar with, being able to look at changes in mood, being able to look at memory recall, both immediate and delayed recall, being able to look at different aspects of anxiety and depression, and of course also the mini mental state exam, which is often used. And the tasks we had over on the right-hand side were reading a text passage aloud, being able to describe this picture, as I mentioned, being able to describe the picture without using keywords. And also we had people read out different sentences with different acoustic parameters in them, which we could use afterwards to do some extra analysis. One of the problems with the mini mental state exam, as you know, is that it's affected by many factors. It's affected by performance, it's affected by the experience of the examiner, and the rating scale obviously is also in question sometimes. So what you try to do also is combine some of those cognitive measures that I showed you on the left-hand side in the previous slide, combine them together and make a combined cognitive score which might be a little bit more reliable. We chose 4 measures. We chose the word recall, both the immediate and the delayed. We looked at category fluency, and we also looked at the backward digit span, which is a focus on working memory. So we combined those into a combined cognitive score to see if that combined cognitive score could be more informative of one's cognitive status. In terms of the technology side of things, we recorded the speech. This is a speech waveform here, for example. What we were interested in was the number of pauses in between each word. So could we automatically detect the pauses? Could we detect silences, or are people stopping at full stops, or are they ploughing through and not seeing the full stop or the comma and not slowing down because of grammatical changes or changes in the actual text itself? So could we extract all of these parameters out automatically? So there was quite a lot of engineering went behind the scenes to be able to process and analyze the data. So what we did then was we extracted out these particular features from speech: the number of pauses, the mean pause duration, the total recording time, the duration of non-speech to speech in the actual text itself. Of course, we had to normalize because everybody speaks at a different rate, so we had to normalize for individuals and their speaking rates so we could compare across different groups. And then looking at the MMSE and having a cutoff of 27, we were able to detect those who had low MMSE score from those who had high MMSE score by just looking at speech parameters with an accuracy of about 69%. So by just recording speech, we'd be able to have an accuracy of 69% to be able to detect if that person has a low MMSE or has a high MMSE. We looked at the combined cognitive scores because we felt that might be a little bit more robust in having a gold standard metric, and we're able to nudge that score up to about 70%. So what we see here is significance in terms of statistics between those with cognitive impairment and those with cognitive healthy, with a cutoff of 27 in the MMSE, being able to compare it between the two cohorts in terms of the proportion of silence and in the actual speech that's spoken out, and the total duration of pauses compared to the actual phonation rate. So how many pauses we have and the length of those pauses seems to be very indicative of cognitive function. We also then looked at the combined cognitive score. We looked at the fixed passage, the passage of text that we asked people to read. We also looked at these picture taboo words, so again, being able to describe the picture you see there without using the word baby or the word bath. And that was also very informative to us. We found out that those would stumble over describing the picture, put a lot of pauses into their phraseology to be able to describe what they see in the picture. Again, that was also seen to be very informative of changes in cognitive function. So statistically, again, the number of silence that was actually present for those describing the picture taboo word, the picture, so for example, the baby without using the word baby or bath, people were stumped. They're looking at the picture, they had 30 seconds to describe what's in it, and a lot of people were humming and hawing without actually describing what's in there. So naturally, you'd imagine that more pauses would pose more difficulty and as a result might be informative of cognitive function. So statistically, we saw there were changes that were present. We found that the percentage of silences, the percentage of mean utterance duration, the length of pauses, the total length of utterances, all parameters, mathematical parameters that we can extract out of speech, which were linked to cognitive function when we compared it with the standard MMSE score. And what we're looking at in the graph here are those with high cognitive function in terms of MMSE, 27 to 30, those with low functioning MMSE, 18 to 28. And we can see here, this is the mean pause duration, the duration of pauses that we would have. If we're speaking very quickly, like I speak very quickly, I would have a low mean pause duration. If you're speaking more pauses, obviously you would have a higher pause duration. So by just looking at some of those parameters, we're able to pick out those with low and high cognitive function on MMSE. What was also informative was the differences that were going on between a picture description task, where I present a picture to somebody and describe what's in the picture, and the task where I present the picture and say, don't use these two words that are at the bottom of it. That was also very informative. And what we found out that those, even with high cognitive function in terms of MMSE, so 29 to 30, and those with 27 to 28, still good in terms of MMSE, we're able to separate those out even more. So if those are scoring very well, they tend to be able to describe what are in the pictures with good accuracy and good fluency. But those who are sliding down a little bit down the scale, in terms of 27, 28, now have a little bit more difficulty. So it was very useful statistically to be able to pull out those who are sliding down in terms of MMSE just by the changes in the speech characteristics. And that turned out to be the mean pause duration was the most significant parameter that we were able to extract out there. So what does all this mean? It means that certainly the picture description task tends to be very informative. Certainly there's a reduction in the content density that people use with low cognitive function, so not able to describe what they're seeing in the picture with good content and the content linked together. There's an increased use of irrelevant content. So as a result, is it linked together in the same way? It tends to be a little bit unlinked and not relevant. So why would this be? What could be explaining these kind of changes? Well, two things really. One is changes in cognitive function and changes in executive function particularly. The attention, the focus, the coordination of different aspects to be able to describe what they're seeing in the picture. That could be very important. If that's not functioning well, we may have these changes in speech characteristics. But it also could be explained by something else. It could also be explained that sometimes we get a lot of speech, but it's not coherent in many ways, and it's not all linked together, is that a lot of the people that we may be testing have not or may not have been tested before. So they may be very verbal and in a social sense and want to be able to talk about lots of different things. So we need to be very careful how we interpret some of this data to make sure that are we doing it in very controlled circumstances, that we're not getting the social situation being highlighted by a lot of irrelevant content in terms of our speech processing here. So interesting how we can interpret some of these results. Some of the other parameters that we tried to extract out from the speech that we recorded were changes of how quickly we can make certain sounds. So if you say the sounds to yourself of P and B, they sound very similar, but when we look at them in terms of, from an engineering point of view, look at the acoustics, a P sound takes longer to make than a B sound, these kind of plosive sounds as they're called. Very important to be able to distinguish, obviously, between P's and B's so we can communicate what we're trying to say to other people. But what's certainly known is that those with poor cognitive function tend to have difficulty differentiating the production of these different sounds. So P's and B's tend to get blended together. That then becomes difficult for others to interpret what people are actually saying. Was it a B or a P, for example, for different types of words? And what we found out was that what's called the voicing onset time in engineering is how quickly we can actually make P's and B's tended to be also very important and a very good predictor of those with low MMSE score, those against those with high MMSE score. And again, this kind of rating we were using here was 26 and 27, but either way, we're able to show differences statistically here. What was also interesting, and I don't know if you can see it on the slide here, what we're looking at here from an engineering point of view is what's called the vowel space. This is a frequency scale here in both the X and Y axis. And what this picture is showing is how well we're able to make different sounds in the spectrum through voice, being able to control our breathing, being able to control our articulators. And what was seen from the data that we acquired here is that as we went older, and as we took cognitive function into consideration, the ability to make certain sounds decreased as cognitive function changed. So we didn't have the flexibility to be able to make higher frequencies or lower frequencies. They tend to be contained in a smaller area. So these are acoustic changes in how we're making sounds, which also seem to relate it to cognitive function. So summarizing what we were able to do in the clinic here in St. James as part of the TRIL project, we're able to collate a large database of speech recordings recorded in a clinical setting, so it was a nice, silent, noise-free room. And as a result, we were able to look at acquiring good quality data and comparing with gold standard measures of cognitive function. So that was certainly one of the highlights that we were able to acquire from this particular study. But we were interested in expanding that a little bit more. We wanted to look at different types of ways we could look at speech and different ways we could probe cognitive function through speech. One of the extra tests that we've brought into the program, the protocol at the moment, is what's called the didokinetic rate, how quickly we can change articulation. So can we say badaka, badaka, badaka very quickly? Can we turn it around and go the other direction? How quickly can we make these sounds? Could be also very informative of showing how we can change and articulate different sounds with great ease, or do we have problems doing that? That could also be informative of cognitive function. What we've done is we've moved our assessment based on the clinic and tried to move that into the home. And the questions you were asking there was, what protocols could we actually deliver in terms of this speech-based analysis remotely? Could we actually deliver it in a remote fashion? Can we collect data the same quality as we can collect in the clinic here, for example? And could we be able to, in some way, reduce some of the labor and the intensive nature of cognitive assessments if we can help a little bit of automating that process? What are the protocols for being able to deliver a remote assessment of cognitive function over the telephone, for example, or in long distances? And could we look at changes in cognitive function using this type of technology over a long time? So we changed our process. We moved to telephone assessments. This time we sent individuals a pack once a month. It contained a series of pictures and it contained paragraphs of text. We asked individuals not to open until we actually telephoned them. And what we were looking at here was trying to repeat some of the same studies we had in the clinic here to see if they would translate into the home. Again, same type of tasks. We had speech tasks to be able to describe pictures, being able to read out certain passages of text, and we also had then standard measures of cognitive function that we could deliver over the telephone. How did that work? Well, we had one of the experimenters in Trinity College telephone the older person, and going through the same procedures as we had in the clinic here to try to replicate as much as possible the same protocol that we had here. So we told the person to open the envelope, maybe open a further envelope inside, envelope 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, for example, and read out the passage of text that was contained there, maybe open another envelope and describe the picture that they're seeing, and could we record all those speech characteristics and could we analyze them afterwards? We carried out 8 interviews over about 8 or 9 months. We had 23 participants, and the point here was to see, are the speech variables consistent with the cognitive function assessment that we were able to carry out. Quite a difficult task to do, making sure that people didn't open the package before, obviously, we did the experiments. Being able to shuffle the photographs around that would have relevance to individuals as well. So it took a lot of time to be able to put this study together, as well as having the interviewer phone the person at a particular time. What was definitely interesting from just the carrying out of this particular study was that people felt very much at ease being able to speak on the telephone as opposed to coming into the clinic. So that was a positive from them. We were hoping that that would be able to allow us to be able to get maybe a better assessment of cognitive function in that way. What initially people weren't set up for the interview, so they actually maybe stood up in the kitchen doing this type of task as opposed to sit down maybe in a more comfortable chair to be able to carry out the assessment, which took about 20-25 minutes. There was great interest in feedback of how people were performing on the task, and in fact, getting the pack in the post every month was very interesting for the participants. They very much enjoyed that. We had to spend a bit of time deciding on what pictures we would give, those of relevance for people, older people. That was quite important, and we spent a lot of time looking and talking about what pictures would be most relevant. And as I say, the interesting aspect of getting something physically in the post was very important to people. What we found that which was a great result, was that the ability to be able to carry out assessment over the phone in this experimenter-led way with the participant at the other side correlated with the type of analysis that we were getting in the clinic. So we had the same quality of data that we could analyze in terms of the number of pauses, the pause duration, the number of silences, the percentage of silence. That correlated very nicely with the data that we had in the clinic here. So it gives us good confidence that those measures are reliable measures. What we have done then in follow-on study now has moved away from having an experimenter telephone somebody to have a system which is completely automatic. So in this case, we have a remote monitoring system built around what's called an interactive voice response system. So the older person can phone a particular service, and as a result, from phoning that service, there's an automated system that brings them through the various experiments in an automated way. There's no user at the other end. The point here being, can we reduce some of the cost of deployment in terms of carrying out assessments of cognitive function for long-term care? So, for example, can we monitor people every month, which could be useful to see changes in cognitive function in some ways? And can we, in some ways, if we see changes, can we close the loop quicker than may be possible at the moment? The types of tasks that we've implemented into the platform have included the cognitive tasks of memory recall, both the delayed and the immediate version, category fluency, a test looking at attention, and also a test looking at mood. And we carry out the same speech tasks of being able to read a passage, being able to describe a picture in different ways, and being able to look at this didokinetic rate, the way to be able to articulate sounds with high repetition. So the development, that study is going on at the moment, the development has been that we've been able to build that system in place at the moment. We've been able to successfully record speech remotely, and the quality of that data is similar to what we've been able to get in the clinic, which is very interesting. And that opens up the possibility then for longer term assessment and analysis of individuals in this low cost and I suppose light touch method of being able to assess, hopefully, cognitive function. How are we going to assess this? Well, obviously it's quite a lot of technology, so we'd want to make sure that we're actually validating and making sure that it actually does what it's supposed to do. We have a study ongoing at the moment of 80 subjects, split into two groups of 40. 40 of them come in and speak to an experimenter on a face-to-face experimentation and the standard way in terms of cognitive assessment, and then we record speech in the standard way with the microphone. And then 2 days afterwards, they have the telephone interview at home and repeat exactly the same process in an automated way. The other 40 do it the other way around. They have the telephone interview first, and then they come in 2 days later and have the cognitive assessment. And our hope, therefore, is that we'll be able to see that things are consistent between the two groups, and that the consistency in terms of being able to extract measures of which could be informative of cognitive function in the remote automated process would be useful for long-term care. So the overall findings of these studies are that certainly we see that speech slowing as we get older, as also has been reported in the literature, and we have loss of prosody, so we get loss of rhythm associated with speech. We also found that speech description tasks, that being able to describe what we see in pictures, tends to be very informative as well. So that tends to be impacting certainly working memory. We've identified speech candidates which could be associated with cognition, so these measures of duration of pauses, the number of silences, etc. Being able to translate that into an automated process and trying to see the validity and ability to be able to do that in an automated fashion is the project that we have ongoing at the moment. And the whole point here is being able to see, can we have remote assessment of cognitive function and mood through the use of speech. So what are the conclusions then? The conclusions then, well, certainly that there's an opportunity, I think, here to be able to use speech processing which can be acquired in automatic ways to look and investigate changes in cognitive function in older people. But what's interesting here is to see also the social and the personal changes that might be accompanying that person, to be able to interpret those results in the right way. Being able to telephone into somebody and look at cognitive assessment is probably not a good thing to do. We need to know exactly what else is going on, and it's actually changes in those patterns which are much more important. I think future studies need to look at other aspects. We need to be able to look at being able to target discourse, being able to narrative discourse. How are we describing things? Are there other ways that we could look at functioning, such as working memory and other biopsychosocial factors which could be changing the way we use language and the way we use speech? So there are huge opportunities here to be able to continue this work in different directions. If I can play this little video here, I thought this would highlight some of the issues associated with cognitive load and speech.
Okay, Houston, I'm on the porch.
So some of you
Roger, Neil.
recognize Neil Armstrong and this very famous clip here.
And we're getting a picture on the TV. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The 11 footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches.
So he's describing obviously as he steps out.
I'm going to step off the lamb now.
Lots of L's and M's and pauses.
It's 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind.
So, very famous phrase, 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind. But actually that doesn't actually make any sense. Because when it's a tautology, 1 small step for mankind, 1 giant leap for mankind doesn't make sense. When he was speaking there, he was lots of ums and ahs. What he should have said here was 1 small step for a man, 1 giant leap for mankind. And it was the cognitive load, as you can imagine, stepping out onto the moon. Other things were going on, that there were changes associated with speech. So Neil Armstrong to this day swears that he actually said that the A sound, the A word came out there, I man. But as we can clearly hear, he didn't mention that. And the cognitive load of everything going on affected the quality of speech that was recorded forever. So it just shows you the changes in language affected with cognitive load and cognitive effort. What are the conclusions then? We've obviously been looking at cognitive impairment in terms of MMSE for older people. What are the conclusions for dementia, maybe for some of the audience here? Well, certainly language pathology, critically important. I think it has a huge opportunity to play here in being able to look at the information content that's associated with dementia, and particularly even maybe differentiating or helping differentiate different forms of dementia. Also in terms of the speech and motor disorders associated with some forms of dementia, critically important. Being able to look at swallowing also, and being able to understand the acoustics of speech and language could be informative into some of these areas also. And I think then what's also important is long-term analysis of changes in cognitive function. So do we have recognized changes in breathing of certain individuals, for example? Could that be informative early on before changes in cognitive function and dementia actually become more apparent in other ways? So are there ways that certainly parents or families or carers could recognize changes in speech and language, which could be early markers before something else is diagnosed? I wanted to finish up with this slide here. This is the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design, which is based out of the National Disability Authority in Clyde Road. And they run a centre which is focused on designing of technologies geared around individuals. So the technologies put together, the assessment in terms of our telephone interviews, how we put together the interactive voice response system, took a huge number of focus groups of older people coming to us in Trinity College to be able to tell us this is what they'd like to hear, these are the types of pictures we'd like to describe, this is the type of voice we'd like to hear if it was on the telephone. It took a huge amount of effort, and a very important effort, to be able to bring older people into the design process. And this particular centre is the national centre, I suppose, of looking at universal design, of putting, obviously, people first in terms of different types of technology, and they run a number of different design challenges for both engineers, but also for a whole variety of different professions to get involved and understand some of the issues of dealing with, for people who may have physical disabilities, but also then may have cognitive disabilities also. Of course, my PhD students and other PhD students in Trinity College and my collaborators are the ones who did all of the work in this study, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Was brought to you by Trinity College Dublin. For further information, please visit our website itunes.tcd.ie.